Let me come, Bob Cruz, to you next. You're a historian, and so I was struck by the cautionary tone of your essay, which warned us not to overdo the comparison between the current moment and that of 1989. You pointed to this remarkable transformation that has taken place in Afghan society, and you described the emergence of multiple publics where new forms of expression and collaboration and contention thrive. Can you talk to us about what the existence, albeit tenuous, of these publics mean for the state building and war fighting that continue in their midst? And how might you imagine the Taliban would contend with these radical new developments? And finally, what opportunities do you think they offer to the world's other democracies to engage Afghanistan as one of their own?
Great. Thank you very much, Dipali. And thank you all. It's a great privilege to have the opportunity to learn from my colleagues from Afghanistan. And of course, thank you again, Mr. Kakar, for including me in this enterprise of trying to make sense of your father's important letters to Najibullah. As Dipali noted, there are lots of parallels to think about. I think that Ambassador Brahimi's comments on that are still very useful. I think for me, looking at it from afar, looking at it as an historian, looking at it from California, so with all those important caveats attached here, what strikes me in looking at Afghan society over the last 30, 40, 50 years is really the dramatic changes that have swept this landscape since 2001. Here, I don't mean to engage in, I know a lot of Americans tend to have a very kind of idealized view of the American impact. And I want to be clear that I'm not claiming a story of progress and of a kind of unitary trajectory toward improvement and reform in a way that makes apologies for all the American policy mistakes. So I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that the American impact has been solely magnanimous or progressive. What I mean to suggest is that the American invasion and then occupation or presence, however one defines it, created a space for all kinds of changes. And as Omar Sadr noted, these changes built upon a very rich and complex and sophisticated intellectual history. All the historians you cited are, of course, important landmark figures in thinking about constitutional foundations for Afghan statehood, for thinking about national identity. And of course, Professor Kakar played an important role in all those debates. So 2001, to my mind, marked a kind of break, but one that was partial, and that it drew upon the very rich cultural, intellectual resources of Afghan political thought. So in my very brief essay, I try to highlight a few areas among many that one could highlight to understand the processes of change that made the society so different from that Najibullah and Professor Kakar tried to understand in 1990. So in my essay, I highlight the role of the media. And here again, I'm echoing some of Omar Sadr's other comments. This mediascape is quite expansive and remarkable in that it has brought together this dynamic diaspora together with very hardworking, very courageous journalists on the ground in Afghanistan. And here too, I don't want to paint a wholly idyllic picture because, of course, Afghanistan is one of the world's deadliest environments to engage in journalism. I'll come to that point in just a moment. So this is not a kind of utopian mediascape, but it's one in which I argue that certain publics have emerged. And here I haven't used public in the singular. I liked Omar's references to different kinds of actors because I think I'm trying to get at something similar, identifying that there are multiple groups in Afghanistan. And from my point of view, looking at it again as a historian, I appreciate Omar Sadr's critique of this, but to my mind, I see something actually quite productive in what I would call the diversification of the Afghan political landscape and of its pluralization. And here, not everyone's rowing in the same boat in the same direction toward a republic, right? Many are moving in different directions, but I think that pluralism, that heterogeneity, that diversification that we see expressed in media are all actually quite productive things in thinking about peace, because they're in a way modeling by engaging in public debate through social media, through old media, through radio, through television. And here I recommend my friend Wajma Osman's book on Afghan television, which is really a brilliant and very careful examination of the ways in which these spaces have worked to advance new ideas under very real constraints, under foreign pressure of funders like the United States, but also under armed militias and powerful businessmen who don't want certain things being said. So it's a very messy sphere, but I think that what is so, I think, particularly productive for us in thinking about peace is the way this mediascape has created space for new voices to emerge. And to me, the most exciting new voice is that of youth. And here, I say youth in the singular, I actually mean plural, because these are actually quite heterogeneous voices. And I've been very grateful to learn from, for example, representatives of the Hazara community who have made religion a subject of these public debates. And one finds very important claim making that Hazara intellectuals make about religion. As you all know better than I, Islam has achieved a new institutional setting in Kabul in particular, but throughout Afghanistan since 2001, which is another major kind of landmark of change. And yet for many Hazara intellectuals, there is a kind of ambivalence about identifying with Shiism. They recognize that Sunnism is also an important feature of many Hazara communities. And broadly, there is a kind of rethinking in the diaspora and elsewhere of the possibility of agnosticism, of religion, but also irreligion. So this kind of pluralism is also seeped into the religious sphere, not just among Hazaras, where I've been looking at this most closely, but we find this across communities. We find it among women who've been drawn to Salafism, who find a kind of activism, a kind of feminism in religious practices that push against the idea of the Republic, perhaps, but which are quite dynamic in our expressions of, again, claim making and of a kind of political engagement in, for example, projects of reform, as they put it, to use the language of reforming the Afghan woman, reforming Afghan society as mothers, as activists, as religious experts as well. So that feature of mediascape, of youth, and then of new religious ideas are all, I think, important points to consider when thinking about how much Afghan society has changed. In this brief essay, I also note popular mobilization, that is street politics, street protests, the use of public spaces as a new kind of claim on public politics, on engagement, on trying to carve some path of participation in this state. Finally, I point briefly to a fascinating realm of aesthetics. We can point to filmmaking, to poetry, to novel writers, the important world of journalism broadly, just people's personal aesthetics. All this has changed so dramatically. And to get to Dipali's question, most importantly, how this all relates to state making and war making in the Taliban, I would just say briefly this, that in its current form, the state has not created avenues for these publics to engage, for them to participate. So this is, I think, a major critique, a major source of frustration for youth and for all these kind of alternative publics who want to have a stake in the shaping of the state, but who are precluded by this very narrow, closed system of politics that currently exists, which is a major impediment to mass mobilization, not just the legitimacy of the state, but of mobilizing all these voices who actually want to engage in some kind of democratic politics, who want to participate, who want to shape the future of Afghanistan. How the Taliban will relate to all this is, of course, remains to be seen, but I think one important index of this is the violence we've seen in recent weeks against Hazaras, for example, at Dashtabarchi, and then all these assassinations of young journalists and young media figures. I think here, this violence against Hazaras and against young media people is an index of the danger that the opponents of the current system see in these dynamic figures. In other words, they see them representing an alternative political order, and they want to wipe this out. So I think that's a kind of measure of the importance of these groups. That is, the violence waged against them is an index of their significance and why we must think about them. The Taliban have adapted in important ways in thinking about creating an image that will be more palatable to Afghans in the future. And they've done, I think, this in a quite sophisticated way with their vast media apparatus to adapt a nationalist rhetoric, and at the same time to adapt a new technocratic language very much modeled upon the United Nations, upon an NGO landscape in Afghanistan. And yet here too, I think there's an interesting mirroring here that is problematic, because when the Taliban speak about new forms of rule that they will, they won't repeat the same mistakes and so on, they adopt a kind of NGO language which thinks of politics as a kind of bureaucratic technique, not as political participation, as engagement, as contestation. So that kind of mirroring, the kind of denial of politics is something that the Taliban, I think, have replicated in talking about how they will perform differently. And so there's a major tension here between the pluralism that has emerged in Afghan society and the very narrow strictures that the Emirate proposes for the future. So that I think both sides, both for advocates of the Republic and for the Emirate, how to accommodate this pluralistic, more diverse environment is really, I think, the fundamental challenge of peace building for both camps.